He was 19, and his friend Josh had just said something ridiculous. "Seek the truth for yourself," Josh laughed, half drunk at a lakeside party north of Dallas, "and I'll meet you there." Then he walked down toward a small cliff over the black water. Mark walked up the hill toward the house. That was the last thing his friend ever said to him. Minutes later, there were sirens. The pool was empty. Everyone was running down to the shoreline. It took divers 3 hours to find Josh's body at the bottom of the lake. Months later, Mark dreamed of him. In the dream, he told Josh he was sorry he died, and Josh just smiled and asked, "Why do you care that I'm dead when you're still so afraid to live?" That question became a book with a crude, unforgettable title that is secretly about death and about the one thing that finally sets you free, learning to choose what's worth caring about. Because here's the trap: most of us are caught in and don't even feel. Everywhere you look, the message is the same. Be happier, be richer, be hotter, smarter, more admired. Crush it before breakfast. And underneath all of it runs a quiet accusation that whatever you are right now isn't enough. So you feel anxious. Then, and this is the cruel part, you notice you're anxious and you get anxious about being anxious. You feel down, then feel like a failure for feeling down. You scroll a feed full of people apparently having the time of their lives, and the gap between their highlight reel and your Tuesday afternoon just widens. Manson calls it a spiral of self-criticism, feeling bad about feeling bad, a loop with no floor. And the strangest thing? The harder our whole culture chases feeling good, the worse we seem to feel. Why? There's a name for it. The philosopher Alan Watts called it the backwards law. The idea is simple and a little vicious. The more you desperately pursue feeling better, the less satisfied you become, because the very act of chasing something reminds you, over and over, that you don't have it. Want to be rich badly enough, and you feel poor no matter what you earn. Want to be loved desperately enough, and you feel lonely in a crowded room. So Manson opens his book with the last person on earth you'd expect in a self-help book, Charles Bukowski, a drunk, a gambler, a failure who wrote honest, ugly poetry no one wanted for 30 years. Bukowski finally became famous, and on his gravestone, he had 2 words carved. Not never give up. Not believe in yourself. Just don't try. Now, before you close the tab, this is the part everyone gets wrong. Not giving a care does not mean being cold or checked out or indifferent. Manson is blunt about it. A person who genuinely feels nothing about anything isn't enlightened. They're just empty. It means something much harder. You only have so much energy to spend caring in this life, a limited budget of it. Most of us hemorrhage it on everything: the rude barista, the online stranger who's wrong, the neighbor's new car, the 1,000 tiny slights of a day. The subtle art isn't caring about nothing, it's caring about less and better. It's spending that budget only on what is true and immediate and genuinely important to you. The whole game is learning to choose what's worth caring about. Everything that follows is about how. To explain why, Manson tells a story that's 2,500 years old. A king wanted to give his son a perfect life, so he built high walls around the palace and made sure the prince never saw a single moment of pain. Only luxury, only comfort, everything he could want. And the boy grew up miserable. Nothing meant anything. So he fled and swung to the opposite extreme, starving himself, sleeping in the dirt, punishing his body for years. And that didn't work either. Suffering for its own sake, he found, is just as empty as comfort. Half dead, he finally sat under a tree, and he understood something. The rich suffer from their riches. The poor suffer from their poverty. To be alive is to have problems, always. That prince became the Buddha, and his first great lesson was this: pain isn't a glitch in life, it's the fabric of it, which flips the whole question of happiness on its head. We treat happiness like an equation. If I get the job, the body, the person, then I'll be happy. But happiness isn't a finish line you cross. It comes from something much stranger: solving problems. And problems never actually end. You just trade them for better ones. So the real question was never, what do you want to enjoy? Everyone wants the mansion and the beach body. That's easy to want. The question that decides your life, Manson says, is this: what pain are you willing to sustain? What are you willing to struggle for? You want the great body, but do you want the sore mornings and the strict meals? You want the business, but do you want the risk and the sleepless failures? Because you don't get the reward without the struggle it's made of. Who you are, he writes, is defined by what you're willing to struggle for. But something got in the way of all this, and Manson gives it a name: entitlement. He tells you about a guy he calls Jimmy. Jimmy always had a big idea, the app that would make billions, the deal about to close. Jimmy oozed confidence. He'd name drop, dazzle, and borrow money from one more distant relative. There was just one problem. Jimmy never actually did anything. He was all talk, propped up by a bulletproof belief in his own greatness. Jimmy, Manson argues, is what a certain promise produced. For decades, we were told the secret to a good life was high self-esteem. Feel great about yourself, no matter what. But a generation later, the data came back. Feeling special doesn't make you exceptional. It just makes you fragile and sometimes insufferable. And entitlement wears two masks. One says, I'm amazing and the rules don't apply to me. The other says, I'm uniquely broken and no one has ever suffered like me. Opposite costumes, same lie, that you're the exception. Both are just ways of avoiding the ordinary, unglamorous work of getting better. So if you're going to suffer anyway, and you are, the only choice that matters is what you suffer for. On a small island in the Philippines, a Japanese soldier named Hiroshi Onoda kept fighting the Second World War. Not for months, for almost 30 years. Leaflets dropped from planes told him Japan had surrendered. He decided they were fakes. His companions died one by one. Still, he hid in the jungle, loyal to an order, fighting a war that had ended decades before. When a young adventurer finally found him in 1974 and told him it was over, Onoda wept. He'd given 30 years to a phantom. And yet, he said he regretted nothing. Onoda suffered enormously, but he chose what he suffered for. The tragedy wasn't the pain. It was that he'd chosen his values so badly. Which raises the real question: how do you choose them well? Meet a man who got everything right and still felt like a failure. His name is Dave Mustaine. In the early 80s, he was thrown out of a rising metal band, and it gutted him. So he swore revenge. He'd build something bigger and crush them. He formed a new band called Megadeth, and it sold 25 million albums. By almost any measure on Earth, a staggering success. But Mustaine, decades later, admitted he still felt like a loser. Why? Because the band that fired him was Metallica, who sold 180 million. He'd spent his life measuring himself against the one scoreboard that could only ever make him lose. He chose a bad metric, and a bad metric can turn even triumph into ash. Now the mirror image. A man who lost everything and won. His name is Pete Best. In 1962, he was the drummer for a band on the edge of a record deal. Days before their first session, the other three quietly had him fired and replaced him with a fellow named Ringo Starr. The band was the Beatles. Pete Best missed being one of the most famous people alive by a matter of days. You'd expect the story to end in bitterness, and for years it did. But decades later, Best said something astonishing. I'm happier than I would have been with the Beatles. Getting cut led him to his wife, his children, a quiet, solid life. His scoreboard changed from fame to family, and by that measure, he'd won. Same event. 2 men. Everything came down to the values they used to weigh it. So this is the hinge of the whole book. Learn to choose what's worth caring about, and that means choosing better values. Some values, Manson says, are poor ones. Pleasure, chased for its own sake. Money, past the point it buys security. Being right all the time. Staying positive no matter what. They feel good, but they depend on things outside your control, and they never solve the problems underneath. Good values are the opposite. Honesty, curiosity, humility, taking responsibility, building something. They're not flashy, but they share three quiet traits. They're based in reality. They're good for you and the people around you. And, crucially, they're things you can actually control. Change your values, and you change every problem you'll ever have. So the work is simply this, again and again, to choose what's worth caring about. Here's the value Manson builds everything else on, and it starts with a thought experiment. Imagine a stranger puts a gun to your head and forces you to run 26 miles, or he kills your family. Terrifying. One of the worst days of your life. Now imagine you train for months, buy the shoes, and run those exact same 26 miles as a marathon, your family cheering at the finish. One of the proudest days of your life. Same distance, same pain, and the same legs. The only difference is that one you chose. That's the whole secret of feeling powerful instead of helpless. And it turns on a word most of us get exactly backwards: responsibility. To feel it, meet a young man who had every reason to give up. William James was sick from birth, half-blind as a child, a ruined stomach, a back so bad he sometimes couldn't stand. He failed at painting. He failed at medicine. He nearly died on an expedition to the Amazon. By his late 20s, he was broke, unemployed, and, in his own words, planning to end his life. But one night he read a passage that stopped him, and he made a strange bet with himself. For 1 year, just one, he would act as if he were 100% responsible for everything in his life. Not at fault for everything, responsible for what he did next. That year, William James became the father of American psychology. He called the experiment his rebirth. Because here's the line, the whole chapter turns on. We don't always control what happens to us, but we always control how we respond. There's a catch, though. To change how you respond, you have to admit something uncomfortable. You might be wrong. Not about one thing, about everything. Manson's point is that your beliefs, your memories, your certainties, they're all approximations, and history is a graveyard of things everyone knew for sure. Growth, then, isn't about becoming right. It's about becoming a little less wrong than you were yesterday. And that requires the one thing the entitled Jimmy could never do: doubt. Certainty, Manson writes, is the enemy of growth. The person who's certain they'll fail never tries. The person who's certain they're a victim never moves. Certainty feels safe, but it's a locked door. So why do we cling to it so hard? Manson has an unsettling answer. We cling to our certainties because they are us, and letting one go can feel like a small death. Manson gives it a name, his law of avoidance. The more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. The insurance adjuster never writes the screenplay, because to try and fail would threaten his idea of himself as a sensible, practical man. Better to stay a man who could have. The party guy never settles down because the party guy is all he knows how to be. We don't avoid the hard thing because it's hard. We avoid it because it threatens who we think we are. Which leads Manson to a strange kind of freedom, letting go of who you think you are. Stop needing to be special or uniquely gifted or uniquely broken. The more ordinary you let yourself be, a student, a partner, a person still figuring it out, the less every setback can wound you. And once you stop protecting that fragile self-image, something opens up. You can finally afford to fail. Manson knows failure. He graduated straight into a recession, got stiffed on rent, spent months on a friend's couch counting coins to decide if he could afford fast food that week, and he says he was lucky because he started at rock bottom, and rock bottom is the one place you can't fall from. There's an old story about Picasso. An admirer approaches him in a cafe as he finishes a quick sketch on a napkin and offers to buy it. He names a fortune. She's stunned. It took him 30 seconds. No, he tells her. It took me 60 years. The failures aren't the detour. They're the road. Pain, Manson insists, is part of the process. Not the thing blocking success, but the raw material it's built from. But if failure is the way forward, one problem remains. How do you start when you don't feel ready? when there's no motivation, no inspiration, no spark? Manson learned the answer from his old math teacher, Mr. Packwood, who used to say, "Don't just sit there, do something. The answers will follow." We think it runs one way. First you feel inspired, then motivated, then finally you act. So we wait for the feeling, and we wait, and nothing comes. Flip it around. Do one small, ugly, imperfect thing. Write the bad first paragraph, make the awkward call, and the doing itself produces a flicker of momentum, which produces motivation, which produces more action. Action isn't just the result of inspiration, it's the cause of it. You don't wait to feel ready. You move, and readiness catches up. So you're moving, you're choosing. But choosing towards something means choosing against almost everything else, and that's where most of us flinch. Manson spent years chasing breadth. 55 countries, endless options, every door kept open. And he discovered a quiet law of diminishing returns. Your first country changes your life. Your 50th barely registers. When every option stays open, none of them can ever go deep. Psychologists call it the paradox of choice. The more options you keep, the less satisfied you are with any of them, forever haunted by the roads not taken. The way out is a word that sounds like a prison and is actually a key. Commitment. Commit to one craft, one place, one person, and you're freed from the exhausting hunt for something better. Freedom isn't having every option. It's no longer needing them. Nowhere is that harder or more misunderstood than in love. We hold up Romeo and Juliet as the great romance, but look closely, Manson says, two kids who knew each other for days and were dead by the weekend. Scholars think Shakespeare wrote it as a warning, not a fairy tale, that the dramatic, all-consuming, can't live without you kind of love behaves chemically a lot like a drug. Healthy love isn't two people using each other to escape their problems. It's two people with strong boundaries, facing their own problems, side by side. And it requires the thing we're most afraid of, freedom to say no, to reject and to be rejected, honestly. Because real love, in Manson's words, isn't caring about everything your partner cares about. It's caring about your partner, regardless. Everything else is negotiable. Which brings us, at last, back to the thing under the whole book, the thing we spend our lives not looking at. A dying anthropologist named Ernest Becker wrote a book called The Denial of Death. His idea, we are the only creature that knows with certainty that it will one day not exist. And that knowledge is so terrifying that we spend our whole lives running from it, building what he called immortality projects. The name on the building, the fortune, the fame. Anything to feel like some part of us will outlast the body. And here's Becker's twist. Our immortality projects are our values. We chase them so hard precisely because they distract us from death. But the projects can become the problem, worth killing for, dying for. Becker's bitter cure was the opposite of running. Turn around, look death in the eye. So Mark Manson goes to look. He's at the Cape of Good Hope, at the bottom of Africa, climbing alone to a cliff edge with a sheer drop to the ocean far below. And he does something his whole body screams at him not to do. He inches toward the edge. At 10 feet, his back stiffens. At 5, his mind starts throwing up images of falling. At 3 feet, where most people stop, his legs shake and his voice trembles. But he keeps going. 2 feet. 1, until he's sitting at the very lip of the world, feet hanging over oblivion, wind screaming, heart hammering. And there, on the edge, the fear burns away into something almost like joy. His mind goes quiet. Nothing makes you feel more alive than standing an inch from your own death. He looks out at the endless blue, and he smiles, and he tells himself, it's all right to die. Because death, it turns out, is the light that everything else is measured by. Take it away, and nothing means anything. Every choice becomes weightless. It's the fact that our time runs out that makes any of it matter at all. That's what a 19-year-old understood on the worst night of his life. Josh's death didn't just break Mark Manson. It woke him up. It was, he wrote, someone else's death that finally gave him permission to live, to quit hiding, to stop performing for a crowd in his own head, to give himself to something bigger than his own fear. That's the whole subtle art. Not a life with no problems, a life of good problems. Not caring about nothing, caring fiercely about a few true things and letting the rest go. Your energy is finite. Your time is running out. So spend them on purpose. Choose what's worth caring about, and then go be brave enough to care. Seek the truth for yourself. Maybe we'll meet you there.